Heavy snow blanketed the Oslo airport runway, transforming the Norwegian winter night into a world of white silence. Through the frost-edged windows of Terminal B, passengers watched ground crews work frantically to keep the departure gates clear. Inside Flight SK 447's business-class cabin, warmth and luxury stood in sharp contrast to the brutal conditions outside. The overhead lights cast a golden glow across leather seats the color of burgundy wine. Crystal glasses clinked softly as flight attendants prepared pre-departure beverages. The air carried hints of expensive cologne and freshly brewed coffee. Eric Larson stood in the narrow aisle, his worn navy blue jacket dampened by melted snow. His hands worked methodically, adjusting the seatbelt for his 7-year-old daughter, Lena. The child's winter coat, bright red with a cartoon reindeer patch on the sleeve, seemed too cheerful for the muted elegance surrounding them. "Daddy, look." Lena pressed her nose against the oval window. "The snow is dancing." Eric smiled, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her forehead. "It is, sweetheart, just like you said it would." His backpack, stuffed with coloring books and a well-loved stuffed elephant, sat at his feet. The fabric showed years of use, frayed at the corners where Lena's tiny fingers had gripped it during countless trips. 3 rows ahead, Victoria Hale observed the scene with the precision of someone accustomed to evaluating everything. At 42, she commanded rooms without raising her voice. Her tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than Eric's entire wardrobe. Diamond earrings caught the cabin light as she tilted her head, studying the father and daughter with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval but certainly wasn't warmth. "Excuse me, sir." A businessman in the adjacent seat cleared his throat. "Could you move along? Some of us have work to do." Eric nodded without making eye contact. "Just making sure she's comfortable. Won't be a moment. There's a family section for that sort of thing," the man muttered, loud enough to be heard. Lena's eyes widened. Eric placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, honey. We're all set now." As he settled into his own seat, Eric heard the whispers. He'd heard them before at parent-teacher conferences when other parents assumed he was a babysitter. At the grocery store when people asked where Lena's mother was with that particular tone of judgment. Victoria watched him produce a battered notebook from his jacket pocket. The cover was held together with clear tape. Inside, she glimpsed crayon drawings, stick figures holding hands beneath a lopsided sun. The flight attendant, Anna Mueller, approached with the drinks cart. Her smile was professional, but her eyes lingered on Lena with genuine warmth. "And what would the young lady like?" Anna asked, bending down to Lena's level. "Apple juice, please." Lena's enthusiasm filled the space around them. "Excellent choice." "And for you, sir?" "Just water, thank you." Victoria accepted her champagne without a word, her gaze still fixed on the odd pair. She'd built her empire Hale Strategic Consulting by reading people, by understanding who belonged where, and this man, with his weathered jacket and discount store backpack, simply didn't fit the business-class narrative. The intercom crackled to life. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Thomas Weber. We're experiencing some weather delays, but we should have you airborne within the next 15 minutes. Flight time to Zurich will be approximately 2 hours. We do anticipate some turbulence due to the storm system, so please keep your seatbelts fastened." Eric pulled Lena's belt a fraction tighter. The girl had already opened her coloring book, selecting a blue crayon to sketch what appeared to be an airplane. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" "Us. Flying to see Grandma." His chest tightened. His mother had been asking to see Lena for months. This trip had taken every spare dollar he'd saved from his job at the community center. Outside, the snow fell heavier now. Ground crews signaled final preparations. The engines began their low rumble, a sound that resonated in Eric's bones with muscle memory he'd tried to bury. Eric closed his eyes, and for a moment he wasn't in business class. He was in a hospital room 3 years ago, holding Sarah's hand as machines beeped their steady rhythm. Her skin had been paper thin, translucent in the harsh fluorescent light. "Promise me," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible over the ventilator. "Promise me you'll give her a normal life. No more risks, no more flying into danger." "I promise," he'd said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Sarah had been his co-pilot in life, though she'd never flown a plane. She'd been a kindergarten teacher who painted watercolors on weekends and sang off-key in the shower. She'd made their tiny apartment feel like a mansion. Pancreatic cancer had taken her in 4 brutal months. "Daddy?" Lena's voice pulled him back. "You okay?" "I'm fine, honey. Just thinking." "About Mama?" He nodded. Lena had her mother's eyes bright green with flecks of gold. "She'd like this," Lena said, returning to her drawing. Flying through the snow. Eric had left the Swedish Air Force 6 months after Sarah's diagnosis. His squadron had been among the elite pilots who could handle the Gripen fighter jet in conditions that grounded everyone else. He'd logged over 2,000 flight hours in high-stress scenarios, had landed on frozen airstrips during Arctic exercises, had pulled maneuvers that required split-second decisions at supersonic speeds. But none of that mattered when his wife needed him. None of that mattered when Lena woke up crying for her mother in the middle of the night. Now he worked at a community center, teaching kids chess and helping with homework. The pay was a fraction of his military salary, but he was home every night. He tucked Lena in, read her stories, helped her practice her spelling words. The business class tickets had been a gift from his mother. "You deserve to be comfortable for once," she'd said. Eric had tried to refuse, but she'd been insistent. "Let someone take care of you, for once." So here he was, surrounded by people who measured worth in quarterly earnings and stock portfolios. He didn't blame them for their stares. He knew what he looked like: tired lines around his eyes, calluses on his hands from fixing things around their apartment because hiring a repairman wasn't in the budget. "Sir, can I get you anything else?" Anna appeared again, her expression kind. "We're good, thank you." She glanced at Lena's drawing. "That's beautiful. Are you an artist?" Lena beamed. "I'm going to be a pilot like my daddy was." Anna's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that right?" Eric felt the familiar discomfort. "It was a long time ago." "Not that long," Anna said gently. "Thank you for your service." He nodded, unsure how to respond. Gratitude always felt strange, like people were thanking him for something that had simply been his life. Victoria had heard the exchange. A pilot. Former military, perhaps. She studied Eric again, trying to reconcile this information with the shabby jacket and the patient way he helped his daughter with her crayons. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Through the windows, Oslo's lights blurred into streaks of gold and white behind the curtain of falling snow. Eric felt Lina's small hand slip into his. "I'm excited," she whispered. "Me too, baby." He didn't tell her he was also anxious. The weather reports had been concerning, but Captain Weber was experienced, and modern aircraft could handle conditions that would have been impossible decades ago. Everything would be fine. It had to be. Victoria Hale had perfected the art of assessment. In boardrooms across Europe, her ability to read people, their strengths, weaknesses, and potential value had made her indispensable. At 42, she'd built Hale Strategic from nothing into a consultancy that Fortune 500 companies called when they needed to restructure, optimize, or eliminate. Her success had come at a cost she rarely acknowledged. 2 failed marriages. A daughter who called her Victoria instead of Mom and lived with her father in London. Friends who drifted away as her calendar filled with client dinners and international flights. But success was measurable. Relationships were not. She trusted numbers, contracts, deliverables. She sipped her champagne, the bubbles sharp against her tongue, and watched Eric adjust Lena's blanket. Something about the scene irritated her, though she couldn't quite name why. Perhaps it was the inefficiency of it, the way he fussed over small details instead of using the time productively. Perhaps it was the visible wear on his clothing that suggested poor financial planning, or perhaps it was something deeper, something that reminded her of Sunday mornings she'd missed with her own daughter, because a client in Singapore needed a presentation refined. First time in business class? The question came from Gregory Whitmore, a hedge fund manager Victoria knew from industry conferences. He'd settled into the seat beside her, his phone still glowing with stock tickers. For them, clearly, Victoria replied, gesturing subtly toward Eric and Lena. Gregory glanced over. Charity upgrade, probably. Airlines do that sometimes. Makes them look good. Or family gift, Victoria said, surprising herself with the defense. Mother's Day? Birthday? Something. Either way. Gregory shrugged. Doesn't quite fit the aesthetic, does it? Victoria wanted to disagree, but found she couldn't. Business class was supposed to be a sanctuary from the chaos of economy, a space where professionals could work undisturbed, where the ambient noise was the gentle clink of glasses rather than crying children and animated conversations. Yet Lena wasn't crying or causing disruption. She was quietly coloring, occasionally whispering to her father. The most noise they'd made was the girl's delighted exclamation about the dancing snow. Still, Victoria thought, there was a natural order to things. People earned their place through achievement, through sacrifice, through strategic decisions that compounded over years. When that order was disrupted, when someone appeared where they clearly didn't belong, it created dissonance. She watched Eric pull out a small plastic bag filled with crackers and cheese cubes, homemade snacks. Something about that detail struck her as simultaneously frugal and touching. "What do you think his story is?" Gregory asked, following her gaze. "Does it matter? You're staring." Victoria turned away. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Sure." Gregory's tone was amused. "My observation? Single dad, probably divorced. Works some kind of blue-collar job. Saving up for this trip for months. Wants to give his kid an experience she'll remember. Former military," Victoria corrected, recalling the flight attendant's comment. "So maybe more disciplined than you're giving him credit for." Former military working at a community center doesn't exactly scream strategic career planning. Victoria didn't respond. Her own father had been military Air Force, actually. He'd retired as a colonel and had never quite understood her rejection of service in favor of business school. "You're too smart to spend your life taking orders," she'd told him. He'd looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. They'd barely spoken in the 5 years before his death. The aircraft lurched slightly as it turned onto the runway. Outside, visibility had decreased further. The snow now fell in dense sheets, illuminated by the plane's navigation lights. Anna moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. "We're expecting a bit of weather," she announced with practiced calm. "Nothing to worry about, but please ensure your seatbelts remain fastened throughout the flight." Victoria tightened hers, an automatic response. She'd flown hundreds of times. Turbulence was routine, but something in Anna's eyes, a flicker of concern quickly masked, suggested this might be more than routine. The engines roared to life, their power vibrating through the cabin. Victoria felt the familiar surge of acceleration as the aircraft began its takeoff roll. Through the window, the world became a blur of white and shadow. The nose lifted. The ground fell away. They were airborne. The climb was steeper than usual. Eric felt it in the angle of his seat, in the pressure against his chest. Captain Weber was pushing for altitude, quickly standard procedure when weather conditions were marginal. Get above the worst of it. Lena gripped her armrest, eyes wide but not frightened. "It's bumpy," she observed. "Just the wind, sweetheart." The plane is strong. At 15,000 feet, the first serious jolt hit. The aircraft dropped what felt like 20 feet in a heartbeat, then recovered. Overhead bins rattled. Someone gasped. Anna appeared with a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just some chop, folks? nothing to worry about. But Eric knew the difference between routine turbulence and something more serious. The intervals between jolts were irregular, a sign of unstable air masses colliding. The storm system was worse than forecasted. At 22,000 feet, the cabin lights flickered. At 28,000 feet, they flickered again and stayed dim for 3 full seconds before recovering. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Weber. We're encountering some stronger than expected headwinds and are adjusting our altitude to find smoother air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Victoria closed her laptop. No point trying to work through this. She'd experienced bad weather before. But something about the captain's tone, too measured, too carefully neutral, triggered her instincts. This wasn't routine. Beside her, Gregory had gone pale. This is normal, right? Turbulence usually is. Usually? Before she could respond, the aircraft bucked violently. Victoria's champagne glass flew from the armrest and shattered against the wall. The cabin tilted at an angle that defied her understanding of how planes should move. Warning bells chimed from somewhere forward. Eric instinctively wrapped his arm around Lena, holding her tight against the seat. Close your eyes, honey. Count to 10 with me. 1, 2, 3. Her voice trembled, but she continued. The plane leveled, but the turbulence continued in waves. Rhythmic jolts that suggested wind shear, dangerous variations in wind speed and direction that could stress even the most robust aircraft. Then Eric smelled it. Faint, but unmistakable. The acrid scent of overheated electronics. He turned toward the cockpit, every sense suddenly alert. That smell meant systems were struggling. In a fighter jet, it could mean failing avionics. In a commercial airliner, it could mean the cabin lights went out completely. Emergency floor lighting activated, casting everything in an eerie green glow. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. Please remain calm. Anna's voice came through the darkness, steady despite the chaos. We've experienced a minor electrical issue. Backup systems are engaged. Everything is under control. But the turbulence was intensifying. The plane shuddered, groaned, bucked like a wild animal trying to throw its rider. Victoria's knuckles were white against her armrest. She'd lived through corporate takeovers, hostile negotiations, threats to her business. But this was different. This was physics and weather and metal stressed beyond design tolerances. Daddy? Lena's voice was very small. I'm here, baby. Right here. Through the window, lightning illuminated the clouds, massive formations that seemed to surround them. The snow had transformed into ice, pelting the fuselage with sounds like gravel on a tin roof. In the cockpit, things were far worse than the passengers knew. Captain Thomas Weber, with 23 years of commercial flying experience, was watching his instruments with growing dread. The left engine's temperature was climbing. Ice accumulation on the wings was beyond normal parameters, and his co-pilot, Julian Krauss, had his hand pressed against his chest. Julian, you okay? Pressure, Julian gasped. Chest. Can't. Talk to me. What are you feeling? Like something squeezing. Thomas keyed the intercom. Anna, I need you in the cockpit. Now. He switched to autopilot, inadequate in these conditions, but necessary, and turned to his co-pilot. Julian's eyes had rolled back. His body went limp. Anna! Thomas shouted as the chief attendant appeared. Julian's unconscious. Medical emergency. I need you to. The aircraft dropped again, harder this time. Alarms screamed. The autopilot disengaged with a warning tone. The stick shook in Thomas's hand as wind shear tried to flip them inverted. He was alone in the cockpit, in the worst storm he'd flown through in his career, with 147 souls depending on him. Anna Mueller had seen many things in her 15 years as a flight attendant. She'd delivered babies, managed drunk passengers, provided CPR to heart attack victims, but she'd never seen a captain's hands shake the way Thomas Weber's were shaking now. Julian Krause lay unconscious on the cockpit floor, his breathing shallow and irregular. Anna had checked his pulse, weak but present. Heart attack, most likely. He needed a hospital. They all needed to be on the ground. "I've radioed ahead," Thomas said, fighting the controls. "Zurich is socked in. Oslo's closed. They're trying to clear a path to Stockholm, but another violent jolt cut him off. The plane rolled 15 degrees to starboard before he could correct. "What do you need from me?" Anna asked. "Get back to the cabin. Keep everyone calm." "And Anna," he met her eyes. "Find out if there's anyone with flight experience. Military, private pilot, anything. You can't be serious. I'm fighting a losing battle here." His voice cracked. "The hydraulics are compromised. I've got one engine running hot enough to fail any minute. And I can't." He swallowed hard. "I can't do this alone." Anna nodded, her professional mask firmly in place despite the terror coursing through her. "I'll find someone." She stepped back into the cabin. The passengers' faces turned toward her, desperate for reassurance she couldn't honestly provide. In his seat, Eric had already unbuckled Lena's seatbelt and was securing her in his own seat, their belts fastened together. "Lena, sweetheart, I need you to be very brave for me." "What's happening?" "The plane is having some trouble. But I promise you, we're going to be okay." "How do you know?" He touched her cheek. "Because I won't let anything happen to you." Victoria watched this exchange with a strange detachment. The man's composure was remarkable, while Gregory beside her was hyperventilating into a paper bag. While other passengers were crying or praying, Eric was utterly calm. That's when Anna's voice came over the intercom. Her tone was controlled, but everyone could hear the underlying urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a medical emergency with one of our flight crew. I need to know if there is anyone on board with military or commercial flight experience. Anyone who has piloted an aircraft in challenging conditions. Please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." Silence. Eric closed his eyes. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Promise me." No more risks. But then Lena looked up at him, and he saw not fear, but absolute faith. "Daddy," she whispered, "you know how to fly planes, right?" "I did, honey. A long time ago. But you remember?" He thought about the countless hours in simulators, the training that had been drilled into him until reactions became instinct. Muscle memory didn't fade completely. The question was whether it would be enough. "I remember," he admitted. Lena squeezed his hand. "Then you should help, but I promised your mother. Mama would want you to help people." Lena's voice was small but certain. She always said that's what heroes do. Eric looked around the cabin. At the businessmen who'd sneered at him. At Victoria with her expensive suit and terrified eyes. At the elderly couple holding hands 3 rows back. At Anna, standing at the front with a composure that was clearly taking every ounce of her strength. 147 people, including his daughter. He stood up. "My name is Eric Larson." His voice carried through the cabin despite the aircraft's groaning protests. "I'm a former fighter pilot, Swedish Air Force. I flew Gripens for 8 years. Anna's relief was visible. "Thank you. Please, come with me." Every eye in the cabin followed Eric as he moved toward the cockpit. Victoria found herself reassessing everything. The worn jacket suddenly seemed less like poverty and more like practicality. The quiet confidence wasn't meekness, it was discipline. "Wait." Gregory grabbed Eric's arm as he passed. "You're just going to leave your kid?" Eric looked down at the hand gripping him, then met Gregory's eyes with an expression that made the hedge fund manager release his grip. "I'm trying to save her," Eric said simply. "And everyone else on this plane." He continued forward. Victoria unbuckled and moved quickly to Lena's seat. The girl looked up at her with those remarkable green eyes. "Hi," Victoria said, surprised by the gentleness in her own voice. "I'm Victoria. I'm going to sit with you while your dad helps the pilots. Okay?" "Okay." Lena held up her coloring book. Do you want to color? Of all the surreal moments in Victoria's life, this ranked among the strangest. The plane was in crisis, her mortality was very much in question, and a 7-year-old was offering her a crayon. Sure, Victoria heard herself say. I'd like that. In the cockpit, Thomas Weber turned as Eric entered. The relief on the captain's face was profound. Thank you for coming forward. I'm Captain Weber. This was my co-pilot, Julian Krauss. He gestured to the unconscious man. Heart attack, we think. Anna's monitoring him, but I need help up here. Eric moved to the co-pilot seat, his eyes scanning the instruments with practiced efficiency. Modern glass cockpit, very different from the fighter jets he'd flown, but the fundamental principles were the same. Airspeed, altitude, heading, artificial horizon. What's our situation? He asked. Left engine is overheating. We've got severe ice accumulation. Hydraulic pressure in System B is dropping. I'm flying manual because the autopilot can't handle these conditions. Eric nodded. Processing. Nearest suitable airport? Stockholm, Arlanda. But we're bucking 60-knot headwinds. At this rate, we won't have enough fuel to make it. So we need to descend, find calmer air, reduce our fuel consumption. Descending puts us deeper into the icing zone, Thomas countered. We could lose both engines. Staying at altitude with a failing engine is equally risky. Eric's hands hovered over the controls, not touching but ready. What's your instinct telling you? Thomas looked at this stranger who'd appeared from the cabin like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was saying. That I need all the help I can get. Then let's get everyone home, Eric said. He reached for the controls, and 20 years of training came flooding back. Eric's first action was to check the fuel calculations. His fingers moved across the touchscreen displays, pulling up data that Thomas had been too overwhelmed to fully analyze. We're burning fuel faster than we should, Eric observed. The headwinds are part of it, but the ice on the wings is creating massive drag. I know, Thomas said, his voice tight. But every de-icing system has limits. We've already cycled through twice. Eric studied the external temperature gauge. -18°C. The ice would be thick, stubborn. He thought back to Arctic exercises, landing Gripens on frozen runways where a single miscalculation meant sliding into a snowbank at 200 kilometers per hour. Do you have experience with these conditions? Thomas asked, hope and desperation mixing in his voice. Different aircraft, similar principles. I've flown through worse. It wasn't entirely true, but confidence was currency in a crisis. The plane shuddered again, and Eric's hands went automatically to the control yoke. The muscle memory was there, deeply embedded. His body remembered, even if his conscious mind had to catch up. I'm going to contact Stockholm, Thomas said. They need to know we're declaring an emergency. While Thomas communicated with air traffic control, Eric focused on the immediate problem. The left engine temperature was climbing into the red zone. If it failed completely, they'd be flying on one engine through conditions that challenged two. Stockholm acknowledges, Thomas reported. They're clearing all traffic and preparing emergency services, but we're still 40 minutes out at current speed. We won't make 40 minutes if that engine goes, Eric said. We need alternatives. He brought up the navigation display, looking for airports within range. Oslo was behind them and closed. Zurich was ahead, but too far. Then he saw at a smaller airport in southern Sweden, military base with a 2,800-meter runway. Ronneby, there. He pointed. 22 minutes at our current ground speed. Military installation, long runway, equipped for emergencies. Thomas hesitated. Landing at a military base in these conditions. I trained there, Eric said. Did 6 months of advanced weather operations. I know that runway better than I know my own street. Thomas looked at him, really looked, and made a decision. Guide us in. In the cabin, Lena was explaining her drawing to Victoria. This is the plane. These are the clouds. And this," she pointed to a small figure near the cockpit, "is my daddy. He's going to make sure we're safe. You trust him a lot," Victoria observed. "He's my daddy," Lena said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Victoria found herself thinking about her own daughter, Charlotte. When was the last time Charlotte had looked at her with that kind of absolute faith? When was the last time Victoria had earned it? Gregory appeared, his face still ashen. "Is it true? Your father is actually flying the plane?" Lena nodded proudly. "He's the best pilot ever. Jesus Christ," Gregory muttered. "We're all going to die. Hey!" Victoria's voice was sharp. Not in front of the child. He retreated, and Victoria surprised herself by pulling Lena closer. The girl smelled like strawberry shampoo and crayons. In the cockpit, Eric and Thomas had divided responsibilities. Thomas maintained basic control, while Eric worked the navigation and systems management. They were a team now, two professionals united by circumstance. "Engine 1 temperature is critical," Eric announced. "We need to reduce power now. If we reduce power, we'll lose altitude. Better than losing the engine entirely." Controlled descent. "We'll find smoother air lower down." Thomas nodded. Together, they eased back the throttles. The descent was anything but smooth. At 24,000 feet, they hit an air pocket that dropped them 500 feet in seconds. At 19,000 feet, the turbulence actually decreased. They'd found the sweet spot between the storm layers. "Engine temperature stabilizing," Eric reported. But new problems emerged. The ice on the wings was thicker now, affecting their lift-to-drag ratio. The aircraft was flying like a brick with wings. "We're going to need every meter of that runway," Eric said grimly. "Can we make it?" Eric ran the calculations in his head. Weight, drag, approach speed, stopping distance. The numbers were tight. Dangerously tight. "We can make it," he said with more confidence than he felt. And if something goes wrong, Eric thought about Lina's absolute trust, about the 146 other people depending on them, about the promise he'd made to Sarah. "Then we improvise." The runway at Ronneby appeared on their navigation display, a thin line of hope still 15 minutes away. 15 minutes that would determine whether everyone lived or died. The weather radar showed what Eric had feared. They were flying into the teeth of the storm. Red and purple blobs indicated severe precipitation. The wind shear warnings were constant now, a symphony of electronic alerts that Thomas had been forced to silence just to think clearly. "Ronneby Tower. This is SK 447. We are 15 miles out, descending through 12,000 feet, declaring full emergency. We have one engine compromised, significant ice accumulation, and limited hydraulic function." The response came in accented English. "SK 447, Ronneby Tower. We copy your emergency. Runway 20 is clear. Winds are 270 at 35 knots, gusting to 50. Visibility 1 kilometer in heavy snow. Emergency equipment is standing by. 50-knot crosswinds." Eric felt his stomach tighten. In a fighter jet, you could muscle through crosswinds using raw power and aggressive inputs. In a commercial airliner loaded with passengers and suffering from compromised systems, you had to be surgical. "I'll talk you through the approach," Eric said to Thomas. "You've got the controls. I'll manage power and systems. You're more experienced in these conditions. You should be flying. You know this aircraft. I don't. We use both our strengths." Thomas nodded, accepting the logic. At 8 miles out, they configured for landing. Flaps to position 1, gear down. Each change added drag, made the aircraft more susceptible to the wind. The landing gear warning lights showed all 3 down and locked, but the nose gear indicator flickered intermittently. "Might be a sensor issue," Eric said, "or might be real. We'll assume real and plan accordingly." At 5 miles, Thomas began the initial approach. The aircraft yawed violently as they entered the full force of the crosswind. He corrected, overcorrected, then found the balance. Steady, Eric coached. Wind is constant from the left. Set up a crab angle, let the plane drift. In the cabin, passengers could see the airport lights through breaks in the clouds. They could also see how the plane was angled oddly, nose pointing into the wind like a bird fighting a gale. Lena squeezed Victoria's hand. "Is Daddy doing okay?" Victoria, who had no idea what was normal for landing an airplane, nodded anyway. "He's doing great." At 3 miles, the left engine temperature spiked again. Warning bells chimed. "Engine 1 is dying," Eric announced, surprisingly calm. "We need to shut it down before it fails catastrophically. On one engine? In this wind? We don't have a choice." Thomas's hand trembled as he reached for the engine cutoff. The moment he pulled it, the aircraft yawed hard to the right. Single-engine flight changed everything: the asymmetric thrust, the altered handling characteristics. "Compensate with rudder," Eric instructed. "You've got this." They were flying on one engine, in a crosswind that could flip them, with ice on the wings and questionable landing gear. Eric ran through the scenarios in his mind. Best case, they landed hard but safe. Worst case, he didn't let himself finish that thought. 2 miles, reduced to approach speed. Flaps to landing position. The airport was visible now, a collection of lights fighting to be seen through the snow. The runway looked impossibly short, impossibly narrow. "I can't see the center line," Thomas said, his voice tight. "Trust your instruments. I'll call out what I see." At 1 mile, a massive gust hit them broadside. The aircraft rolled 30 degrees. Overhead bins burst open. Bags and coats tumbled into the aisle. Someone screamed. Thomas fought the controls, muscles straining. Eric worked the power and trim, trying to give Thomas every advantage. "We're too high," Eric said, "and too fast. I can't slow down anymore or we'll stall. Then we go around. Abort and try again." But even as Eric said it, he knew the truth. They didn't have fuel for another attempt. This was it. "We're landing," Thomas said through gritted teeth. One way or another, the runway threshold lights appeared below them. Too high, too fast, but they were committed now. 50 feet, Eric called out. 40, 30. The wind shear alarm screamed a final warning. 20 feet, cut power, flare. Now, Thomas pulled back on the yoke. The nose came up. For a moment, they were suspended between sky and earth, between hope and disaster. Then the main gear touched. Once. Bounced. Touched again. Harder. "Reversers," Eric shouted. Thomas deployed them, but with only one engine, the braking thrust was asymmetric. The aircraft swerved left. Right rudder. Full right rudder. The nose gear slammed down, and suddenly they were hydroplaning on ice and slush at 140 knots. The runway lights streaming past in a blur. Eric's fighter pilot instincts took over. Anti-skid is failing. Pump the brakes. Short bursts. Thomas followed instructions. The aircraft shuddered, slowed incrementally. But the runway end was approaching with terrifying speed. "We're not going to stop in time," Thomas said. Eric saw it too. They needed another 50 meters that they didn't have. "Emergency runway extension is gravel and mud," he said. "If we can keep it straight, we'll slide to a stop. If we don't, then we'll know we tried our best." The runway end marker flashed past. They shot off the paved surface onto the emergency extension. The nose dipped as they hit softer ground. The deceleration was violent, throwing everyone forward against their seatbelts. 50 meters into the extension, traveling at 30 knots, the nose gear collapsed. The aircraft tilted forward, grinding to a halt in a spray of mud and snow. Then silence, absolute silence. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. The cabin was perfectly still except for the tick of cooling metal and the whistle of wind through a cracked window seal. Then Lena's voice, small and wondering. "We stopped." That broke the spell. A sob from somewhere in the rear. a laugh that bordered on hysteria, the sound of seatbelts clicking open. "Nobody move," Anna's voice cut through the chaos. "Remain seated until the captain gives the all-clear." In the cockpit, Eric was running through post-landing procedures with mechanical precision. Fuel pumps off. Electrical systems to battery only. Fire suppression armed. "You did it," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "You actually did it." "We did it," Eric corrected. "I couldn't have flown this plane without you." Through the windscreen, they could see emergency vehicles racing toward them across the snow-covered field. Red and blue lights cut through the white darkness. Thomas keyed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have landed safely at Ronneby Air Base. Emergency services are approaching the aircraft. Please remain calm and seated. Cabin crew will provide evacuation instructions shortly." His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the yoke to steady them. Anna appeared in the cockpit doorway. "Julian is breathing easier. I think he's stabilizing." "Good." Thomas unbuckled. "Let's get everyone off this plane." Eric stood, his legs unsteady. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the crisis was fading, leaving exhaustion in its wake. He needed to get to Lena. The cabin erupted in applause as he emerged. Faces that had looked at him with disdain now showed gratitude, respect, wonder. Eric barely registered it. His eyes found Lena, still strapped in beside Victoria. "Daddy!" She unbuckled and launched herself at him. He caught her, held her tight enough to feel her heartbeat against his chest. "You're okay," he whispered into her hair. "You're okay." "I knew you would save us," Lena said with absolute certainty. "I told Victoria you were the best pilot." Eric looked over his daughter's head at Victoria. The CEO's carefully composed mask had cracked. Her eyes were wet. "Thank you," Victoria said simply. The evacuation was orderly despite the unusual circumstances. Emergency slides weren't needed. The aircraft had settled at an angle that allowed ground stairs to be positioned. Passengers filed out into the snow, greeted by Swedish emergency personnel with blankets and hot drinks. Eric carried Lena down the stairs. At the bottom, a paramedic tried to guide them toward a waiting ambulance. "I'm fine," Eric said. "Check the others first." "Sir, you were just in a crash landing. You need to be evaluated." It wasn't a crash. It was a controlled emergency landing. The distinction seemed important to him. "And my daughter comes first." They were directed to a heated hangar where survivors were gathering. Someone had set up tables with coffee and sandwiches. Children's voices echoed in the vast space, relieved, excited, processing the adventure they'd survived. Lena stayed pressed against Eric's side, her earlier bravery giving way to the natural fear of a 7-year-old who'd just experienced something terrifying. He sat with her on a folding chair, wrapping them both in an emergency blanket. "Your attention, please." A Swedish military officer stood at the front of the hangar. "I'm Colonel Anders Lindholm. On behalf of Ronneby Air Base, welcome to Sweden. The airport authority has been notified. Arrangements are being made for transportation to Stockholm. Medical personnel are available for anyone who needs attention." He paused, his eyes finding Eric in the crowd. "I understand we have a former fighter pilot to thank for bringing everyone down safely. Sir, would you identify yourself?" Eric raised his hand slightly. He wanted no attention, no ceremony, just to hold his daughter and feel the ground solid beneath them. But the colonel walked over anyway. The crowd parted to let him through. "Captain Larson, just Eric. I'm not active duty. Once a pilot, always a pilot." The colonel extended his hand. "That was extraordinary flying, particularly in unfamiliar aircraft. You saved 147 lives tonight. Captain Weber did the flying. I just helped. However you want to frame it." The colonel smiled. "Your squadron would be proud." Eric nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. 3 hours later, in a hotel near Stockholm where the airline had arranged accommodations, Eric finally had time to process what had happened. Lena was asleep in the adjoining room, exhausted by the evening's events. He stood at the window, watching fresh snow fall on the quiet city. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Victoria Hale stood in the hallway, no longer wearing her perfect suit. She'd changed into casual clothes, provided by the airline jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, less intimidating. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. "Not at all. I wanted to apologize. Properly, I mean. Not just a quick thank you in the chaos." Eric gestured her inside. They sat in the small seating area, the awkwardness palpable. "You don't need to apologize," Eric said. "Yes, I do." Victoria looked at her hands. "I judged you. From the moment you boarded, I looked at your jacket, your daughter, your whole situation, and I made assumptions about who you were, about what you were worth." "You weren't wrong about the economic situation," Eric said without bitterness. "I'm not wealthy. I work at a community center. This trip was a gift from my mother because I couldn't afford it myself. But I was wrong about everything that matters." Victoria's voice cracked. "I thought success meant corner offices and quarterly profits. I thought value could be measured in salary and status. And then you stood up this man I'd dismissed as not belonging, and you saved all of us. Any pilot would have done the same. But there weren't any other pilots. There was you." She met his eyes. "You gave up a military career to raise your daughter. You work a modest job because it lets you be there for her. You were willing to risk everything tonight to save strangers. That's not failure. That's something I don't think I've ever achieved." Eric didn't know what to say to that. "I have a daughter," Victoria continued. "Charlotte. She's 12. Lives with her father in London. When the plane was going down, all I could think about was that I haven't seen her in 4 months. 4 months. And when I do see her, I'm checking my phone, thinking about clients, present, but not really there." "It's not too late," Eric said gently. "Isn't it? I don't know your situation, but I do know that kids are resilient, and they want their parents. Even when those parents aren't perfect." Victoria wiped her eyes. "How did you do it? Choose her over everything else?" Eric thought about Sarah, about the promise he'd made. "I didn't have a choice. My wife died. Lena needed me. But I think—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I think the real choice was realizing that being needed was a gift, not a burden. That flying jets was thrilling, but watching Lena learn to read was equally extraordinary. Different, but equal. I've built an empire," Victoria said quietly, "and I'm eating dinner alone in hotel rooms. Empires can be rebuilt. Time with your daughter can't be recovered." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the snow continued its quiet fall. "The hedge fund manager, Gregory," Victoria said. "He asked me in the hangar what I learned from all this. You know what I told him? That business class and economy land at the same airport. That none of our status matters when the ground is rushing up at us." "That's true," Eric acknowledged. "But it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just that our differences don't matter. It's that we were measuring the wrong things all along." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Thank you, Eric. Not just for landing the plane, for showing me what courage actually looks like. It's not confident decisions in boardrooms. It's choosing to be present for a 7-year-old even when the world tells you to chase bigger things." After she left, Eric checked on Lena one more time. She was sprawled across the bed, her stuffed elephant clutched tight. One of her hands still had a smudge of blue crayon. He thought about the life he'd built since leaving the Air Force. It was small by most metrics. Modest apartment, basic car, second-hand clothes. Tomorrow, they would continue to his mother's house. Lena would show her grandmother the drawing she'd made on the plane. They would eat simple meals and play board games and maybe build a snowman if the weather cooperated. It wouldn't make headlines. Nobody would write articles about their quiet life. But Eric understood something that had eluded him in his fighter pilot days. The most important missions weren't flown at supersonic speeds. They were lived in ordinary moments, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, being present. Outside, the winter night wrapped around Stockholm like a blanket. The snow fell steadily, covering everything in white. Pure, clean, perfect. And in that hotel room, a father watched his daughter sleep and knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be.